Our scripture this morning is from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, 25 through 34. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from a flow of blood for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his cloak, I will be made well." Immediately her flow of blood stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately, aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my cloak?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease."
Circle the wagons, duck and cover, seal the gates, close up shop, hunker down. What's your go-to expression on a scary day? What's your go-to expression? What's your way of saying hide that doesn't sound quite so cowardly or defeatist? Even possum playing dead sounds better than go hide. Like it has some agency to it, like it's playing to its strengths. No matter how we phrase it, there are times we just want to go hide, but none of us wants to admit that we're hiding out. Last Monday, some of us zoomed in for an interfaith service from Memphis. Leaders from the United Church of Christ, Sojourners, Metropolitan Community Churches, Unitarian Universalists, all got together for this interfaith service. We heard greetings from Hindu community, from Muslim, from Jewish. My friend Nathan Wilson was back from the World Council of Churches to read scripture from a Christian voice. I was able to watch friends and colleagues scurrying behind the scenes, helping do logistics. It was fun to watch. But then the preaching started and the singing started. The messages were powerful, but one that really stuck with me, Dr. Rosalind Nichols, one of the pastors in Memphis, talked about her desire to hide. With all the people being brave and speaking prophetically, Dr. Nichols talks about her spiritual escape. That since November, she says, she's been binging Netflix and some Apple TV, calling people up and asking what should she watch, avoiding the news like the plague. And she said she looked over on her nightstand and saw her copy of Sojourners. And on top of that, her Bible, just sitting there waiting on her. And she realized she was intentionally avoiding the resources that were at hand for her. She was intentionally avoiding the problems that were there. She described it as living in a post-crucifixion reality, a Good Friday reality. From November till now, she says, I've been living in Good Friday. I've been avoiding the problems. And when I do go into the world, when I'm at Costco, I look around and I trust no one. She talks about living in a post-crucifixion reality, still weeping and gnashing her teeth. By the service, she said she realized she was headed to an interfaith service of support. She was going to a church, a place where things are supposed to get better, where we're supposed to look for some answers. And she realized that maybe she had shifted from Good Friday into Saturday night. Still in the upper room, sitting with the disciples, looking around and asking, what in the Hades do we do now? As she reflected on her own journey, Dr. Nichols said she turned to Hebrews 5. She quoted the King James Version saying, "Do not neglect the assembling of yourselves." In the NRSV, Hebrews 5, 24 and 25 together says, "And let us consider how to provoke one another to love and good deeds, not neglecting to meet together as the habit of some has become, but encouraging one another all the more as we see the days approaching." When things seem worse, do not neglect the assembling of yourselves. In other words, putting ourselves back together and putting ourselves together in space, that we might provoke one another to love and good deeds. I love when provoke gets used in a positive light. When things seem worse, we need to reach out. Yes, we may want to hide, but we don't have to hide alone. We may need to retreat to regroup, but you can't regroup by yourself. You need a group. We may need to recharge our emotional batteries, but what are we charging them up for? Or is just recharging become our excuse to hide? In our scripture today, Mark tells us about a woman who has been alone. She was isolated by her condition. Women bleeding were considered unclean, so when she spent time with others, they become unclean and have to go that difficult journey to go get blessed, proclaimed unclean, so they can re-enter community. They had been socially distancing this woman in painful ways. She had been socially distancing herself. She was isolated by her suffering, and how quickly does compassion fatigue set in from all those who might have supported her along the way? How many others have become numb to her pain and oblivious to her absence? She was isolated by her finances and emotions, having spent on doctors for years. How much was left in her coffers? How much was left in her spiritual tank? How she must have longed for a meal, not just to eat, but to sit at a table and just look at other people eating with her. How she must have longed to gather with others, even if they were just watching a movie parallel playing. How she must have longed for bystanders on the street corner to see her. Not see and avoid, not see and pity, not see and judge, but to see her, to know her. How she must have longed for human connection. So, she reaches out. She picks Jesus as the one she's going to reach out to. Good choice, better than many of us. I don't know I would have noticed. When Jesus passes by, she goes chasing after. Forgetting the traditions that kept her trapped, forgetting the judgment that kept her isolated, ignoring the questions of, will it make a difference? Am I too old to matter? Do I deserve to feel joy? Ignoring the questions of emotional walls and spiritual scars, she goes chasing after Jesus, reaching out. And after fighting through the crowd, struggling to catch up with him, she reaches out and grabs a hold of his robe, and her world changes. Her world changes. This woman had circled the wagons, hunkered, ducked and covered, sealed the gates, closed up shop, hunkered down, and even more. She had gone as far as to carry her burden, learn her role, don't make a scene, don't bother others, and suffer in silence. For all the expressions we have for hiding, we have even more for suffering without bothering others. We have even more expressions for justifying our avoidance of each other. For all the ways we have to say we're hiding, we have more excuses for not seeing. How did we imagine? How did we get to this place? How did we convince people that needing help was something to be ashamed of? Shouldn't the community that ignores the needs of others be ashamed? Shouldn't the community that fails to respond to another's needs be ashamed? Shouldn't a community that shames those in need rather than help them be the one ashamed, be the one that's unclean? But here we are. 2,000 years later, shaming those who seek safety and a new life in our country, pretending they're dangerous and pretending they're all criminals. Shaming those who don't fit someone else's definition of normal, pretending they're just choosing to be different rather than learning to see the world differently. Pretending they're causing trouble rather than confronting our culture's troubling lack of love. Shaming those who would feed the poor and heal the sick, pretending those people deserve their place in life, rather than actually fulfilling the teachings of Jesus. Pretending that people bring these issues upon themselves, rather than to admit that we live in a system that is designed to exploit the poor. In our story today, in our scripture, a woman reaches out. From beyond her isolation, her poverty, her brokenness, her loneliness, and she is healed. The act of reaching out brings healing. Now, Mark's gospel has a curious turn of phrase here. Some of you may have noticed it. Others may have just remembered that I've said this in other sermons. Either way, it's okay. It's probably your own recognition. No one remembers what I preach a month later. It's okay. Oh, it's okay. I preach the same sermon about once a month. No one sees it. Now everybody's going to be waiting to see if it's the same scripture next month. Now, Mark's gospel tells us she touched the hem of his robe and she was healed. Are you with me? This is the order of events. And then Jesus tells her, be healed. Why? Be healed? She just was. It happened the verse before. She grabs the robe, she's healed. Then why does Jesus heal her? Here's the fun part. When the woman touches her robe, the word here in the Greek is iomai. Iomai. It's a healing of the body. Her bleeding stops. Jesus speaks to her and says, your faith has made you sozo. Be sozo, which means complete, whole, or saved. Wholeness. Sozo. She touches his hem and she is healed, and then Jesus turns and tells her, be healed. Be physically well and to be whole. The woman in our story, according to Mark, comes looking for sozo. She knew that more than her body was wounded. She knew the emotional and spiritual toll of her hurt, and she wanted it all. She has a miracle by touching Jesus. Her body is healed, and then the work of the woman, her hope, her reaching out, inspires Jesus to bless her with sozo, with wholeness. Sometimes the world is unsafe. A turtle needs to go back into its shell. We've all been there. But we don't have to stay there. Poke your head out. Let us face the fox with you. Sometimes the world feels unsafe and a possum needs to play dead. We get it. We've been there. But don't just lay there and wait on a car to hit you. Wiggle your tail. Twitch a paw. Let us come lay down with you. Let us come lift you up and take you to safety. Sometimes the world is unsafe. Bad things happen. People do hurtful things, and we want to hide. But do not neglect the assembling of yourselves. We cannot neglect the assembling of ourselves, the gathering of each other. But it's easier to gather us if we're not all hiding. And others who are hiding need us to come out and find them. Do not neglect the assembling of ourselves. Do not neglect to gather together to connect. Do not neglect to reach out and to let others in. It's easy to reach out and say, everybody's welcome, but don't come into my space. We need to gather ourselves so that we may provoke each other in love and acts of good deeds, so that we can remind each other that we are not alone, even when we hide. so that we can reach out to each other, so that we can seek sozo, wholeness and healing, together. Together.